Chapter 7.
Jake Spoon stood in the door of the Low House, watching Call and Dietz head for the barn. He had been looking forward to being home from the moment he looked out the door of the saloon and saw the dead man lying in the mud across the wide main street of Fort Smith. But now that he was home, it came back to him how nervous things could be if Call wasn't in his best mood. "Dietz's pants are a sight, ain't they?" he said mildly. "Seems to me he used to dress better." Augustus chuckled. "He used to dress worse. Why, he had that sheepskin coat for 15 years. You couldn't get in 5 feet of him without the lice jumping on you. It was because of that coat that we made him sleep in the barn. I ain't finicky except when it comes to lice." "What happened to it?" Jake asked. "I burned it. Done it one summer when Dietz was off on a trip with Call. I told him a buffalo hunter stole it. Dietz was ready to track him and get his coat back, but I talked him out of it." "Well, it was his coat," Jake said. "I don't blame him." "Hell, Dietz didn't need it. It ain't cold down here. Dietz was just attached to it because he had it so long. You remember when we found it, don't you? You was along." "I may have been along, but I don't remember," Jake said, lighting a smoke. "We found that coat in an abandoned cabin up on the Brazos. I guess the settlers that run out decided it was too heavy to carry. It weighed as much as a good-sized sheep, which is why Call gave it to Dietz. He was the only one of us stout enough to carry it all day. Don't you remember that, Jake? It was that time we had that scrape up by Fort Phantom Hill." "I remember a scrape. The rest is kind of cloudy," Jake said. "I guess all you boys have got to do is sit around and talk about old times. I'm young yet, Gus. I got a living to make." In fact, what he did remember was being scared every time they crossed the Brazos, since it would just be 10 or 12 of them, and no reason not to think that they would run into 100 Comanches or Kiowas. He would have been glad to quit rangering if he could have thought of a way to do it that wouldn't look bad, but there was no way. In the end, he came through 12 Indian fights and many scrapes with bandits, only to get in real trouble in Fort Smith, Arkansas, as safe a town as you could find. Now that he had come back, it was just to be reminded of Maggie, who had always threatened to die if he ever left her. Of course, he had thought it was just girlish talk, the kind of thing all women said when they were trying to hold a fella. Jake had heard such talk all the way up the trail, in San Antonio and Fort Worth, Abilene, Dodge, Ogallala, and Miles City, the talk of whores pretending to be in love for wine. But Maggie had actually died, when he had only supposed that she would just move on to another town. It was a sad memory to come home to, though from what he knew of the situation, Call had done her even worse than he had. "Jake, I noticed that you have not answered me about Clara. If you've been to see her, I would like to hear about it, even though I begrudge you every minute." "Oh, you ain't got much begrudging to do," Jake said. "I just seen her for a minute, outside a store in Ogallala. That darn Bob was with her, so all I could do was tip my hat and say good morning." "I swear, Jake, I thought you'd have more gumption than that. They live up in Nebraska, do they?" "Yes, on the North Platte," Jake said. "Why, he's the biggest horse trader in the territory. The Army gets most of its horses from him, what Army's in those parts. And the Army wears out a lot of horses. I reckon he's close to rich." "Any young'uns?" "2 girls, I believe," Jake said. "I heard her boys died. Bob wasn't too friendly. I wasn't asked to supper." "Even old dumb Bob's got enough sense to keep the likes of you away from Clara. How did she look?" "Clara?" Jake said. "Not as pretty as she once was." "I guess it's a hard life in Nebraska," Augustus said. After that, neither of them had any more to say for a few minutes. Jake thought it ill-spoken of Gus to bring Clara up, a woman he no longer had any sympathy for since she had shown him the door and married a big dumb horse trader from Kentucky. Even losing her to Gus wouldn't have been so bitter a blow, since Gus had been her beau before he met her. Augustus felt his own pangs, irked mainly, that Jake had had a glimpse of Clara, whereas he himself had to make do with an occasional scrap of gossip. At 16, she had been so pretty it took your breath, and smart, too. A girl with some sand, as she had quickly shown when both her parents had been killed in the big Indian raid of '56, the worst ever to rake that part of the country. Clara had been in school in San Antonio when it happened, but she came right back to Austin and ran the store her parents had started. The Indians had tried to set fire to it, but for some reason it didn't catch. Augustus felt that he might have won her that year, but as luck would have it, he was married then to his second wife, and by the time she died, Clara had developed such an independent mind that winning her was no longer an easy thing. In fact, it proved an impossible thing. She wouldn't have him, or Jake either, and yet she married Bob Allen, a man so dumb he could hardly walk through a door without bumping his head. They soon went north. Since then, Augustus had kept his ears open for news that she was widowed. He didn't wish Clara any unpleasantness, but horse trading in Indian country was a risky business. If Bob should meet an untimely end, as better men had, then he wanted to be the first to offer his assistance to the widow. "That Bob Allen's lucky," he remarked. "I've known horse traders that didn't last a year." "Why, hell, you're a horse trader yourself," Jake said. "You boys have let yourselves get stuck. You should have gone up north a long time ago. There's plenty of opportunity left up north." "Well, that may be, Jake, but all you've done with it is kill a dentist. At least we ain't committed no ridiculous crime." Jake smiled. "You got anything to drink around here?" he asked. "Or do you just sit around all day with your throat parched?" "He gets drunk," Bolivar said, waking up suddenly. Augustus stood up. "Let's go for a stroll. This man don't like folks idling in his kitchen after a certain hour." They walked out into the hot morning. The sky was already white. Bolivar followed them out, picking up a rawhide lariat that he kept on a pile of firewood back by the porch. They watched him walk off into the chaparral, the rope in his hand. "That old pistolero ain't very polite," Jake said. "Where's he going with that rope?" "I didn't ask him," Gus said. He went around to the spring house, which was empty of rattlesnakes for once. It amused him to think how annoyed Call would be when he came up at noon and found them both drunk. He handed Jake the jug, since he was the guest. Jake uncorked it and took a modest swig. "Now, if we had some shade to drink this in, we'd be in good shape," Jake said. "I don't suppose there's a sporting woman in this town, is there?" "You are a scamp," Augustus said, taking the jug. "Are you so rich that's all you can think about?" "I can think about it, rich or poor," Jake said. They squatted in the shade of the spring house for a bit, their backs against the adobe, which was still cool on the side the sun hadn't struck. Augustus saw no need to mention Lorena, since he knew that Jake would soon discover her for himself and probably have her in love with him within the week. The thought of Dish Boget's bad timing made him smile, for it was certain Jake's return would doom whatever chance Dish might have had. Dish had committed himself to a day of well digging for nothing, for when it came to getting women in love with him, Jake Spoon had no equal. His big eyes convinced him that he'd be lost without him, and none of them seemed to want him just to go on and be lost. While they were squatting by the spring house, the pigs came nosing around the house looking for something to eat, but there wasn't so much as a grasshopper in the yard. They stopped and looked at Augustus for a minute. "Get on down to the saloon. Maybe you find Lippy's hat." "Folks that keep pigs ain't no better than farmers," Jake said. "I'm surprised at you and Call. If you gave up being lawmen, I thought you'd at least stay cattlemen." "Well, I thought you'd own a railroad by now, for that matter. Or a whorehouse, at least. I guess life's been a disappointment to us both." "Well, I may not have a fortune, but I've never said a word to a pig either," Jake said. Now that he was home and back with friends, he was beginning to feel sleepy. After a few more swigs and a little more argument, he stretched out as close to the spring house as he could get, so as to have shade for as long as possible. He raised up on an elbow to have one more go at the jug. "How come Call lets you sit around and guzzle this mash all day?" he asked. "Call ain't never been my boss. It's no say-so of his when I drink." Jake looked off across the scrubby pastures. There were tufts of grass here and there, but mostly the ground looked hard as flint. Heat waves were rising off it like fumes off kerosene. Something moved in his line of vision, and for a moment he thought he saw some strange brown animal under a chaparral bush. Looking more closely, he saw that it was the old Mexican's bare backside. Hell, why'd he take a rope if all he meant to do was shit, he asked. Where'd you get that greasy old bastard? We're running a charitable home for retired criminals, Augustus said. If you'd just retire, you'd qualify. Darn, I forgot how ugly this country is, Jake said. I guess if there was a market for snake meat, this would be the place to get rich. With that, he put his hat over his face, and within no more than 2 minutes began a gentle snoring. Augustus returned the jug to the spring house. It occurred to him that while Jake was napping, he might pay a visit to Lori. Once she fell under Jake's spell, he would probably require her to suspend professional activities for a while. Augustus viewed this prospect philosophically. It was his experience that a man's dealings with women were invariably prone to interruptions, often of a more lasting nature than Jake Spoon was apt to prompt. He left Jake sleeping and strolled down the middle of Hat Creek. As he passed the corrals, he saw Dish straining at the windlass to bring up a bucket of dirt out of the new well. Call was in the lot, working with the hell bitch. He had her snubbed to a post and was fanning her with a saddle blanket. Dish was as wet with sweat as if he'd crawled out of a horse trough. He'd sweated through the hat band of his hat. He even sweated through his belt. Dish, you plumb wet, Augustus said. If there was a well there, I'd figured you fell in. If folks could drink sweat, you wouldn't need no well, Dish said. It seemed to Augustus that his tone was a shade unfriendly. Look at it this way, Dish, Augustus said. You're storing up manna in heaven working like this. Heaven be damned, Dish said. Augustus smiled. Why, the Bible just asked for the sweat of your brow. You're even sweating from the belt buckle, Dish. That ought to put you in good with the seraphim. The reference was lost on Dish, who bitterly regretted his foolishness in allowing himself to be drawn into such undignified work. Augustus stood there grinning at him as if the sight of a man sweating was the most amusing thing in the world. I ought to kick you down this hole, Dish said. If you hadn't loaned me that money, I'd be halfway to Matagorda by now. Augustus walked over to the fence to watch Call work the mare. He was about to throw the saddle on her. He had her snubbed close, but she still had her eye turned so she could watch him in case he got careless. You ought to blindfold her. I thought you knowed that much. I don't want her blindfolded, Call said. If she was blindfolded, she might bite the post next time instead of you. Call got her to accept the blanket and picked up his saddle. Snubbed as she was, she couldn't bite him, but her hind legs weren't snubbed. He kept close to her shoulder as he prepared to ease on the saddle. The mare let go with her near hind foot. It didn't get him, but it got the saddle and nearly knocked it out of his hand. He kept close to her shoulder and got the saddle in position again. Remember that horse that bit off all of that old boy's toes? All the ones on the left foot, I mean, Augustus said. That old boy's name was Harwell. He went to the war and got killed at Vicksburg. He never was much of a hand after he lost his toes. Of course, the horse that bit him off had a head the size of a pumpkin. I don't suppose a little mare like that would take off 5 toes in one bite. Call eased the saddle on her, and the minute the stirrup slapped against her belly, the mare went as high as she could get, and the saddle flew off and landed 20 feet away. Augustus got a big laugh out of it. Call went to the barn and returned with a short rawhide rope. If you want me to help, just ask me, Augustus said. I don't, Call said. Not from you. Call, you ain't never learned. There's plenty of gentle horses in this world. Why would a man with your responsibilities want to waste time with a filly that's got to be hobbled and blindfolded before you can even keep a saddle on her? Call ignored him. In a moment, the mare tentatively lifted her near hind foot with the thought of kicking whatever might be in range. When she did, he caught the foot with a rawhide rope and took a hitch around the snubbing post. It left the mare standing on 3 legs so she could not kick again without throwing herself. She watched him out of the corner of her eye, trembling a little with indignation. But she accepted the saddle. Why don't you trade her to Jake, Augustus said. If they don't hang him, maybe he could teach her to pace. Call left the mare saddled, snubbed, and on 3 legs, and came to the fence to have a smoke and let the mare have a moment to consider the situation. "Where's Jake?" he asked. "Catching a nap," Augustus said. "I reckon the anxiety wore him out." "He ain't changed a bit," Call said. "Not a darn bit." Augustus laughed. "You're the one to talk. When's the last time you changed? It must have been before we met, and that was 30 years ago.
You got friends you care about,
Look
right?
at her watch
Friends
us,
who
Call
know all
said.
about you, and
The
if
mare
they
was
got
watching
caught, you
them,
do them a favor,
even had her
right?
ears pointed at him.
Shy of breaking them
"I
out,
wouldn't
best
take
thing
it
you
as
can
no
do for a friend in
compliment,"
the port
Augustus
is
said.
put 'em out
"She
to
ain't
pasture.
watching you
Hey,
because she
rather
loves you."
6 feet of dirt than 2
"Say
feet
what you
of dirt,
will," Call
right?
said. "I
That's
never
what
seen
we
a
do
more
for my old
intelligent
friend
filly."
today. They got him in a
Augustus
prison
laughed
wagon by
again.
comedy.
"Oh, that's what you look for, is it? Intelligence. You and me's got opposite ideas about things. It's intelligent creatures you got to watch out for. See, I don't care if they're horses or women or Indians or what. I learned a long time ago there's much to be said for dumbness. A dumb horse may step in a hole once in a while, but at least you can turn your back on one without losing a patch of your hide." "I'd rather my horses didn't step in no holes," Call said. "You reckon somebody's really on Jake's trail?" "Hard to judge. Jake was always nervous. He's seen more Indians that turned out to be sage bushes than any man I know." "That dead dentist ain't a sagebrush," Call said. "No, in that case, it's the sheriff that's the unknown factor," Gus said. "Maybe he didn't like his brother. Maybe some outlaw will shoot him before he can come after Jake. Maybe he'll get lost and end up in Washington, D.C., or maybe he'll show up tomorrow and whip us all. I wouldn't lay money." They fell silent for a moment, the only sound the grinding of the windlass as Dish drew up another bucket of dirt. "Why not go north?" Call said, taking Augustus by surprise. "Why, I don't know. I've never given the matter no thought. So far as I know, you haven't either. I do think we're a shade old to do much Indian fighting." "There won't be much," Call said. "You heard Jake. It's the same up there as it is down here. Indians will soon be whipped. Jake does know good country when he sees it. Sounds like a cattleman's paradise." "No, it sounds like a goddamn wilderness," Augustus said. "Why, there ain't even a house to go to. I've slept on the ground enough for one life. Now I'm in the mood for a little civilization. I don't have to have operas and streetcars, but I do enjoy a decent bed and a roof to keep out the weather." "He said there was fortunes to be made," Call said. "Stands to reason he's right. Somebody's gonna settle it up and get that land. Suppose we got there first. We could buy you 40 beds. The surprising thing to Augustus was not just what Call was suggesting, but how it sounded. For years, Call had looked at life as if it were essentially over. Call had never been a man who could think of much reason for acting happy. But then he had always been one who knew his purpose. His purpose was to get done what needed to be done. And what needed to be done was simple, if not easy. The settlers of Texas needed protection from the Indians on the north and the bandits on the south. As a ranger, Call had had a job that fit him, and he had gone about the work with a vigor that would have passed for happiness in another man. But the job wore out, and in the South it became mainly a matter of protecting the cattle herds of rich men like Captain King and Shanghai Pierce, both of whom had more cattle than any one man needed. In the North, the Army had finally taken the fight against the Comanches away from the Rangers, and had nearly finished it. He and Call, who had no military rank or standing, weren't welcomed by the Army. With forts all across the northwestern frontier, the free-roving Rangers found that they were always interfering with the Army, or else being interfered with. When the Civil War came, the governor himself called them in and asked them not to go. With so many men gone, they needed at least one reliable troop of Rangers to keep the peace on the border. It was that assignment that brought them to Lonesome Dove. After the war, the cattle market came into existence, and all the big landowners in South Texas began to make up herds and trail them north to the Kansas railheads. Once cattle became the game and the brush country filled up with cowboys and cattle traders, he and Call finally stopped rangering. It was no trouble for them to cross the river and bring back a few hundred head at a time to sell to the traders who were too lazy to go into Mexico themselves. They prospered in a small way. There was enough money in their account in San Antonio that they could have considered themselves rich had that notion interested them. But it didn't. Augustus knew that nothing about the life they were living interested Call particularly. They had enough money that they could have bought land, but they hadn't, although plenty of land could still be had wonderfully cheap. It was that they had roved too long, Augustus concluded when his mind turned to such matters. They were people of the horse, not of the town, and that they were more like the Comanches than Call would have ever admitted. They had been in Lonesome Dove nearly 10 years, and yet what little property they had acquired was so worthless that neither of them would have felt bad about just saddling up and riding off from it. Indeed, it seemed to Augustus that that was what both of them had always expected would happen. They were not out of the settled fraternity, he and Call. From time to time, they talked of going west of the Pecos, perhaps rangering out there, but so far only the rare settler had cared to challenge the Apache, so there was no need for rangers. Augustus had not expected that Call would be satisfied just to rustle Mexican cattle forever, but neither had he expected him to suddenly decide to strike out for Montana. Yet it was obvious the idea had taken hold of the man. "I'll tell you what, Call," Augustus said. "You and Dietz and P go on up there to Montana and build a nice snug cabin with a good fireplace and at least one bed, so it'll be waiting when I get there. Then clear out the last of the Cheyenne and the Blackfeet and any Sioux that look rambunctious. When you done that, me and Jake and Newt'll gather up a herd and meet you on the Powder River." Call looked almost amused. "I'd like to see the herd that you and Jake could get there with," he said. "Herd of whores, maybe." "I'm sure it would be a blessing if we could herd a few up that way. I don't suppose there's a decent woman in the whole territory yet." The thought struck him that there could be no getting to Montana without crossing the Platte, and Clara lived on the Platte. Bob, Ellen, or no, she would ask him to supper, if only to show off her girls. Jake's news might be out of date. Maybe she had even run her husband off since Jake had passed through. Anyway, husbands had been got around a few times in the history of the world, if only to the extent of having to set a place for an old rival at the supper table. Such thoughts put the whole prospect in a more attractive light. "How far do you reckon it is to Montana, Call?" he asked. Call looked north across the dusty flats, as if estimating in his mind's eye the great rise of the plains stretching even farther than hearsay, away and beyond the talk of men. Jake that morning had mentioned the Milk River, a stream he had never heard of. He knew the country he knew, and had never been lost in it. But the country he knew stopped at the Arkansas River. He had known men to speak of the Yellowstone as if it were the boundary of the world. Even Kit Carson, whom he had met twice, had not talked of what lay north of it. But then his memory went back to a camp they had made on the Brazos many years before with an army captain. There was a Delaware scout with him who had been farther than any man they knew, all the way to the headwaters of the Missouri. "Remember Black Beaver Gus?" he said. "He'd know how far it was." "Yeah, I remember him. It was always a puzzle to me how such a short-legged Indian could cover so much ground." "He claimed to have been all the way from the Columbia to the Rio Grande," Call said. "That's knowing the country, I'd say." "Well, he was an Indian. He didn't have to go along establishing law and order and making it safe for bankers and Sunday school teachers like we done. I guess that's why you're ready to head off to Montana. You want to help establish a few more banks." "That's aggravating," Call said. "I ain't a banker." "No, but you done many a banker a good turn," Augustus said. "That's what we done, you know. Killed the dirt Indians so they wouldn't bother the bankers." "Well, they bothered more than bankers," Call said. "Yes, lawyers and doctors and newspaper men and drummers of every description," Augustus said. "Not to mention women and children," Call said. "Not to mention plain settlers." "While women and children and settlers are just cannon fodder for lawyers and bankers," Augustus said. They're all part of the schemes. After the Indians wipe out enough of them to get your public outcry, and we go chouse the Indians out of the way, and if they keep coming back, then the Army takes over and chouses them worse. Finally, the Army will manage to whip them down to where they can be squeezed onto some reservation, so the lawyers and the bankers can come in and get civilization started. Every bank in Texas ought to pay us a commission for the work that we done. If we hadn't done it, all the bankers would still be back in Georgia, living on poke salad and turnip greens. I don't know why you stuck with it. That's the way you think, Call said. You should have gone home and taught school. Hell no, I wanted to look at it before the bankers and lawyers get it. Well, they ain't got to Montana, Call said. If we go, they won't be far behind, Augustus said. First ones that get there will hire you to go out and hang all the horse thieves and bring in whichever Indians have got the most fight left, and you'll do it, and the place will be civilized. And then you won't know what to do with yourself, no more than you have the last 10 years. I ain't a boy, Call said. I'll be dead before all that happens. Anyhow, I ain't going there to law. I'm going there to run cattle. Jake said it was a cattleman's paradise. You ain't a cattleman, Call. No more'n I am. If we was to get a ranch, I don't know who would run it. It seemed to Call the mare had probably stood on 3 legs long enough, and he had surely jawed with Gus long enough. Sometimes Gus sang a strange tune. He had killed as many Indians as any ranger. He had seen enough of their butchery that you'd think that he knew why he was doing it. And yet when he talked, he seemed to be on their side. As to the ranch, he said, the boy could run it. He's nearly grown. Augustus puzzled over that for a moment, as if it had never occurred to him. Well, maybe so, Call, he said. I guess he could run it if he was a mind to, and if you would let him. I don't know why he wouldn't be a mind to, Call said, and walked over to the mare.